and a couple of topics out of the new book that I'm writing that is focused not on today's third generation, but on the future of OT security. So first topic I'd like to talk about is credibility. Credibility is a word that you do not see in a lot of modern advice, but it's coming. I'm working with some standards bodies on risk assessment standards for OT security, and the word credible is replacing the word likelihood in parts of the standard. I'd like it to be all of the standard, but at least parts of. What does this mean? Credible means not who is reasonable to believe, but what is reasonable to believe. What are credible threats? Well, here's one example. This is from Waterfall's latest threat report. We put out a report every year that talks about the deliberate cyber attacks, not errors and omissions, not equipment failures, deliberate attacks that caused physical consequences. Not stole some money, not could have caused a consequence but didn't quite. Deliberate attacks, physical consequences in the industries we serve, which is heavy industry and critical industrial infrastructure, in the public record. No private disclosures. The entire data set is public. As you can see, for a decade, 2010 through 2019, there was nothing happening. There was between 0 and 5 attacks. I mean, pop quiz. We've all been around for a long time. How many attacks in the year 2010 met this criterion? Deliberate attack, physical consequence, heavy industry, public record. How many attacks were there? There was 1. It was Stuxnet. 2011, there was 0. This was the era of Dragonfly and Havocs that were stealing information from OPC servers but not shutting anything down. For the whole decade, it bounced around between 0 and 5, and then it changed. And what changed was ransomware. The other column here is a little misleading. The other includes unknown. Because we rely on public reports, you know, you go to the front page of the New York Times and you read a report about an incident, and you know, we're technical. We read the report and go, this can't possibly all be true. It's self-contradictory. And so you cannot trust some of the information you read. It's written by well-meaning reporters who don't necessarily understand what they're writing about. So the other includes unknown. Most of the unknown, in my opinion, is also ransomware. Ransomware is what changed at the beginning of the decade. Last year, there were 76 attacks that caused physical consequences at more than 1,000 sites. Most of the attacks affected multiple sites, in heavy industry, in the public record, and most of these attacks were ransomware. The modern attack pattern is called pivoting. The bad guys find a way to deploy a rat. They might steal some, phishing attacks. They might steal some credentials. They might trick a fool like me into clicking on an attachment that downloads a remote access Trojan, a piece of malware that lets the bad guys remotely control my compromised computer and use my computer to attack other computers on the same network until they find a computer that has permission to go through a firewall. And then they pivot again through that computer, through the firewall, take over another computer, start issuing it commands. This is the modern attack pattern. Ransomware uses it, nation states use it, everyone uses it. When you hear the phrase advanced persistent threat, it means pivoting attacks. That's what it means. The high end of ransomware using these pivoting attacks has become indistinguishable from nation states. Last year, I don't have the slide here, but last year there were 3 times as many nation state attacks as the year before. Nation state attacks are increasing as well. The high end of ransomware, the criminals are so rich, they can afford to buy attack tools from the low end of nation states. The criminals are so rich they have the ability to develop their own attack tools that are powerful enough, that are so powerful that nation states are starting to buy the ransomware attack tools. The high end of ransomware and the low end of nation states have become indistinguishable. This is today's credible threat. This is the pervasive threat we all face. I was talking to some folks just this morning out there saying, yeah, but we have a firewall at the IT-OT interface. I'm going, ransomware knows how to pivot through firewalls. Every ransomware attack that took over any IT network, how many ransomware attacks took over IT networks last year? Thousands. Every one of those attacks came through the IT to internet firewall. didn't it? Ransomware pivots through firewalls. So does the low end of nation states. So does the high end of nation states, for that matter. Every attack that's happened in the past is reasonable to believe it will happen again. 20 years ago, a lot of these attacks were theoretical. Nobody believed it was reasonable to defend against these attacks. Today, they're happening every day. Has any cyber attack ever compromised a safety system? Yep, that was Triton. That's now a credible threat. It's going to happen again. Has any cyber attack ever erased the firmware on industrial devices, erased it so thoroughly that the devices had to be thrown out? They could not be reflashed with the correct firmware anymore. Yep, that's happened several times. That's a credible threat going on. What happens if 80% of the PLCs in one of our plants are bricked with zeroed firmware and we have to throw them out? Can we get replacements for them anymore? Do we have replacements in stock? This is what we're up against in terms of credible threats. Cloud-based attacks. What happens if one of our industrial vendors, who's serving 100 plants like ours, if one of their cloud systems is compromised and we're connected to it? What happens if attack information enters our network through the encrypted connection to the cloud service or services that we're using? Hasn't happened in the industrial space, has happened in the IT space. I maintain it's a credible threat. So, this is what we're up against. And the word credible is more than just applied to threats. It works into risk. So this is an example. Gentleman I know, Jesus Molina in Barcelona, Spain, is teaching 62443 to rail system engineers. And he asked, take the standard risk matrix and assign a security level target to each box in the matrix. Now, I know this is not quite the way you do a risk assessment in 62443. You're supposed to assign a security level target to every zone and every asset. But for the sake of argument, he said, just to get used to the idea, assign security level targets to the risk matrix. And he says the strange thing is, to a 1, they came back with a matrix that looks like this. So he asked them, what's going on here? What do you guys know that I don't? They use likelihood and consequence on the left side of the matrix, and the right side of the matrix for unacceptable high consequence events. We're talking passenger rails, passenger trains colliding, mass casualty events. It's all SL4. They said, Jesus, this is the law in Spain. When the worst case consequence is unacceptable, by law, we are required to use all practical defenses to prevent that outcome. In the 62443 space, that's SL4. So the language of risk currently talks about likelihood. Likelihood makes sense for high frequency, low impact events. The fool Andrew clicked on another attachment. We had to clean out his laptop and 2 other machines. It cost $3,000. It's happened 4 times this year. We have statistics. We can do ROI calculations. When we have no statistics, an attack has never happened. Is it reasonable to believe that it will happen? Well, it has unacceptable consequences. In that space of never happened and unacceptable consequences, this is where the word credibility comes in. What is reasonable to believe? And I'm working with these standards committees. This is one of the proposals that's being considered. Change the standard risk matrix. On the low end, continue looking at impact and frequency. Throw out likelihood. We have frequency data. When we have frequency data, multiply frequency times impact, and you get a number that has units that make sense. On the right-hand side, where we have no frequency data, we have to ask the question, is this consequence acceptable or not? If it's acceptable, it belongs on the left-hand side. Buy insurance for it. If the consequence is unacceptable, as a rule, we cannot buy insurance for it anymore. The insurers will not sell us cyber insurance for a mass casualty event. You can't buy that anymore. And so we have to do something else. And so we look at the design basis threat. This is the line between the attacks we defeat with a high degree of confidence and the attacks we do not defeat with a high degree of confidence. And we have to ask the question, are there any credible attack scenarios that we do not defeat with a high degree of confidence? If so, what are we going to do about them? I don't have an answer to that question, But it's an important question. It's a question you cannot ask with the word likelihood. What if we have a lot of low likelihood attacks that we do not defeat with a high degree of confidence? There's always a lot of low likelihood attacks we do not defeat with a high degree of confidence. You can imagine bizarre, not reasonable attacks. Is it reasonable to believe that the adversary will buy or compromise every employee in a power company except the CEO? Is it reasonable to believe that? You can imagine that attack. What would the CEO do to defend the power company? They can't. It's over. There's always low likelihood attacks that you cannot defeat reasonably. That's not the question we're going to be asked. We're going to be asked, what have you done about credible threats? Without that word, we can't even ask the question. So this is a debate that's going on in the space, and it's coming out on the side of we need to use this word for discussions of high impact, low frequency events. And this is actually a topic that's going to be in my next book. In my current book, I talk about the evolution of standards, and credibility is something that is part of the third generation of OT security advice. The first generation came from IT. I mean, when this whole exercise, OT security, did not exist, practically did not exist before the 9/11 attack, before the aircraft flew into the World Trade Centers. Within 2 years of the aircraft flying into the World Trade Centers, people were saying, what else have we missed? And one of the things that was concluded by various authorities that we've missed OT security. And so the first initiatives started coming together. My boss was part of those initiatives, contributed to the first standards that came out of the ISA SP99, which is now 62443. Where did those engineers get their expertise? They asked the experts. The only experts that were available were IT experts. What did the IT experts tell us? They told us, and I'm grateful for this, I don't criticize them. They told us information is the asset. Protect the information. That's what we do on IT. That's what you have to do in OT. It wasn't even called OT back then. Protect the information. And the engineers looked at that and said, thank you for that. They wrote it down. They tried to do it. But as we did it for a decade, we started scratching our heads going, how do we protect information? Encrypt it all. We just encrypted the attacks. The second generation of advice, and the first generation is still with us. People still talk about confidentiality, and they still talk about protecting information as the asset. That terminology will always be with us. There's a constant leakage of IT experts, IT security experts into OT, and they bring with them that perspective. We will never get rid of that perspective. But the second generation of advice was engineering focused. It said, look, the only way that you can turn a control system from a normal state into a compromised state is if attack information enters the system. Information is the enemy. Cyber sabotage is information. And so what we need to do is inventory all of the ways that information can flow into our system and control the flow of that attack information. Not protect it, control it, because it is potentially the enemy. The third generation is focused on resilience, it's focused on credibility, it's still coming together. It's still a work in progress. But here's one example, a piece of advice that came out from something like 14 authorities in 9 different nations, talked about principles of OT security. It asked a question I've never seen asked before, talking about what's reasonable. It says, look, if there's potentially a cyber incident, or if you know there's a cyber attack underway in your OT network, and all of our safeties are software-based, and we don't yet know if the software has been compromised, is it reasonable to send incident response teams into the site when we cannot assure their safety, when we cannot assure that the software systems are operating correctly to assure their physical safety? That's a really important question. Again, I don't have an answer, but that's a question I've never seen an authority ask before. So this is part of the perspective of the third generation. A lot of the rest of the third generation is captured in a new initiative called Cyber-Informed Engineering out of Idaho National Laboratory. What is it? It is saying, look, cybersecurity, OT security is a coin with two sides. One side of the coin is cybersecurity. Teach engineers about cyber attacks, because you use a knowledge of attacks to evaluate the strength of your defenses, to evaluate your residual risk. You must understand attacks if you want to evaluate residual risk. Teach the engineers about attacks, teach them about cyber defenses, teach them about the limitations of what IT's put in place, so they can't wave their hands anymore and say, oh, IT's got that solved. Bang, 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 they're through. What do you mean they're through? You explain this to the engineers and they start demanding stronger security. The other side of the coin is engineering. If every one of us works in an old school coal-fired power plant, we are responsible for 6 boilers, twice as tall as his room, just as big as his room, massive devices. We calibrate the instrumentation, we replace it when it fails. If every one of us is a technician working 8 hours a day within the kill radius of a worst-case boiler explosion, how would each of us prefer to be protected from a cyber attack that overheats the furnace under all of our boilers simultaneously? Would we prefer a mechanical valve, a spring-loaded valve, where if the pressure of the steam is too high, it forces the valve open, the steam escapes, and there's no explosion? Or would we prefer a longer password on the PLC controlling the furnaces? The gurus say, Andrew, you're trying to deceive us. You're asking the wrong question. They want the overpressure relief valve. They want 4 of them, thank you, because these things are mechanical. They do fail. There's corrosion, there's metal fatigue. And they want the longer password on the furnaces. And they want an absolute boatload of cybersecurity beside it. And this is the right answer. When you spend a coin, what side of the coin do you spend? You spend the whole coin. What are we talking about? The coin has 2 sides. One side has been neglected, but both sides are essential to OT security. We've neglected the engineering approach to designing out consequence. And this is, a big part of cyber-informed engineering. Look at your credible threats, and as much as practical, design out the consequences. Make them physically impossible. So, back to the power plant example. The bad guys get in, they overheat the furnace, the overpressure valve engages, the steam escapes, nobody dies. What else happens? Almost always, the plant operator lifts the cage on the big red mushroom button and triggers an emergency shutdown. Why? Because the physical defense, that valve, is our last-ditch defense. The bad guys defeated 3 layers of cyber defense. They defeated 2 layers of software safeties. The last-ditch defense engaged to save our lives. We shut the plant down until we understand what just happened here. How did that happen? And what are we going to do to make sure this never happens again? And in doing so, we've put national security at risk. Really? Where did national security come from? The legal definition of critical infrastructure is critical to the nation. If we shut down a large power plant, 6 boilers the size of this room, we have shut down critical infrastructure. How do we prevent that? We have to prevent the attack getting into the network in the first place. Because if it gets into the network, something, the security systems, the safety systems, the protection systems, the electromechanical systems are going to trigger a shutdown. If we need to keep the lights on, we have to keep the attack information out. And so this is network engineering. It is chapter 5 in my new book. It is a collection of techniques to deterministically prevent attacks pivoting across a consequence boundary, across a connection between 2 networks with dramatically different worst-case consequences of compromise. One example is safety systems. If we need to monitor our safety systems without risk of compromising the safety systems, put 4 to 20 milliamp loops as outputs of the safety system. Send a heartbeat, 1 or a 0, changing once a second, saying I'm still alive. Send a status, I've tripped or not. And if I've tripped, send a status reason, a number between 0 and 27, because there's only 27 reasons the safety system can shut the plant down. Turn off heart on those interfaces. That's the messaging part of the interface. Just do the analog signaling. I defy you to pivot ransomware, to pivot a malware to pivot a remote access Trojan across a 4 to 20 milliamp loop into a safety system. That's one example of deterministic prevention of attacks pivoting through a consequence boundary. The most widely used example is the unidirectional gateway. This is technology that NIST, the NIST 882 standard defines as a combination of hardware and software. The hardware is physically able to send information in only one direction, usually out of the OT network into the IT network. The software is where the magic is. The software makes copies of servers. If we have a historian server, if we have an OPC server on the OT network, the software makes a copy of that server in real time out to the enterprise network. And anybody on the enterprise network who needs the data can ask the enterprise server for the data and get the same answer as the live system would have given. Again, attack scenarios. If a firewall is fully patched and the firewall is configured correctly, then it should not allow attack information into the OT network. With this device, it does not matter how it's configured. It does not matter if it's fully patched. The hardware cannot allow any attack information into the OT network. Again, the most widely used example of network engineering, deployed almost always at the IT-OT interface. The second most common deployment is at the OT to cloud interface, which is the topic of my next book. The cloud is coming, AI is coming. We need to figure out how to do it safely, but that might be next year's speaking topic. Something else that is brand new in the field of network engineering is hardware-enforced remote access. This is a document that came out about a year ago, came out of 3 nations, New Zealand, Australia, and New Zealand, Canada, the United States, 9 different authorities in those countries. Five different authorities. Sorry, can't count. Network access, really what they mean is remote access. And they say, look, on IT networks, stop using VPNs. They're not safe enough. Stop using firewalls and VPNs. Stop using jump hosts. They've said use a bunch of other technologies, most of which are cloud-based. They said half of our employees are cloud-based anyway. On IT networks, use that stuff. On high-consequence OT networks, they've said use unidirectional remote screen view or hardware-enforced remote access. This is something new in the world. What is it? It is 2 unidirectional gateways working together. The lower gateway is sending screen images out. The upper gateway is sending encrypted keyboard and mouse information in. Again, attack scenarios. If, each gateway has 2 CPUs in it, there's 4 CPUs in this solution. If both of the internet-facing CPUs are compromised, both of them, for whatever reason, has the attacker, if the firewall CPU is compromised, you pivot through into the OT network, it's all over. If the VPN CPU is compromised, you pivot into the OT network, it's all over. If you compromise the CPUs, the exposed CPUs here, well, the lower CPU does you no good because the hardware is pointing outward. Nothing can get back in. The upper CPU is the one that's sending keystroke and mouse in. So you might imagine you could send SYN floods and whatnot in. Doesn't work. The hardware throws it out. The only thing the hardware lets through is encrypted keystroke and mouse. But the key information, to try and fake the encrypted keystroke and mouse, the key information is in the laptop. The key information is on the inside CPU. Taking over that inbound CPU buys you nothing. So again, this is a technology that is stronger than software remote access. It's arguably weaker than unidirectional remote screen view, but unidirectional remote screen view is attended. You need someone on the inside. This is unattended. So again, innovation is happening in this space in the 3rd generation of looking at the problem. I've talked about some of the risk blind spots, protective relays, bricking devices. You'll have access to the presentation when I'm done here. The language, credibility, reasonable, the language, the perspective is evolving. When we make decisions about other people's safety, we have a legal obligation to make reasonable decisions. Credibility is what's reasonable to believe. Reasonable practical defenses are what we have to deploy. We have a legal obligation when we see credible threats of unsafe conditions or conditions that impair national security, we have a legal obligation to deploy the strongest practical protections. And this is the emerging field in cyber-informed engineering of network engineering. That's what I had for you. Thank you so much for listening. And free copies of my book are available.